Okay, it is 7 o'clock, and I will call to order the Plainfield Charter Township Board meeting for November 22nd, 2021. We'll start our meeting with invocation by Kathleen, immediately followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Kathleen?
Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to serve Plainfield Township. Lord, I pray that you would give us wisdom in the decisions that we make. Lord, help us to listen carefully to all the information and to make the best decision possible for the future of Plainfield Township and the current environment that we live in, Lord. And I just pray that you would bless our decisions and our community, Lord, and keep us all safe as we move forward through the rest of this year. In Jesus' name, amen. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. Next on our agenda would be the time for public comments. This could be anything to do with township business. There will be a time later when, if it's a new item, new business item, there will be open public comments at that time for those items individually. So you have 3 minutes. I will recognize you if you raise your hand. Please go to the podium, state your name and address for the record, and you'll see the 3-minute clock for your time allowed. This is not a question and answer back and forth session, but when we do these public comments, and especially later with the new business, we'll make an attempt, if we can, to answer questions and so forth, but that's usually how we conduct our business. So with that being said, I would also like to acknowledge Senator Mark Huizinga, who is here with us this evening, and I believe Mark has a couple words for us. So Mark, why don't you go first, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here with you tonight. I'm just here to introduce myself. I'm the newly elected senator for this district, and I'm fulfilling the balance of the term from Senator McGregor, who became the county treasurer. Previously, I served as a 74th District State Rep. I was a mayor of the city of Walker. I served on the City Commission in Walker, and I served on the Planning Commission in Walker. So I've been in many of your shoes and understand a lot of the local issues, and so I appreciate what you guys go through. In my work in the appropriations side of things, I worked in the House as an appropriator. I chaired the General Government Subcommittee on Appropriations, and this last term I chaired the Higher Education Subcommittee on Appropriations. I've also worked on DHHS, transportation funding, and a variety of other things. I was also appointed to a special task force looking at information technology services across the state and how we spend that money. I'd like to just talk a little bit, just briefly, about the fact that I like to be available. I've done office hours 5 times a month throughout the district in the 74th District, and I'll continue that tradition as a senator. And we talked today, actually, that December we'll have some office hours in Plainfield Township, so I look forward to being there. I've always run on transparency, availability, and accountability. My cell phone's out there, and I'd be honored if you ever had any issues that you feel free to call me. And I may not return the call immediately, but I will always return a call. So with that, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Anyone else for public comments at this time? Ken?
My name is Ken Chester. I live at 2564 Rock Hill Drive in Plainfield Township. Thank God this is a township meeting and not a school board meeting. This is about the sidewalk ordinance tonight. I've read it. It's long. It's been layered up. And I hope they weren't charging billable field hours when they did this. It would be so much simpler to have a special assessment district. I hope this ordinance is not complaint driven, because it'll be a failure. People will not complain. You used a form of eminent domain, and I might be calling that a little wrong, to tear down the Whitmark building and using safety as one of the reasons. Yet snow-covered sidewalks are a big health and safety problem. The problems I have with this ordinance, I don't know when this was passed, but there's parts of sidewalks that are in disarray now. I walk 5 times a week down Plainfield and Jupiter Trail. So it's disconcerting that you want to have them cleaned within 48 hours after 2 inches of snow. However, you can't use a mechanically driven vehicle, but you're going to be using one on the Jupiter Trail. And secondly, every summer, if you go by there, they have those lawn machines up and down the sidewalks. You can't tell me these things are that much heavier than what it would be to take a snowplow down these things. In another part of the ordinance, you will send them a letter, but they might get 60 days to remove that obstruction. By then, winter's almost over. Or if the owner might face a fine up to $500 a day, depending on how much they like you, because it doesn't say it is $500 a day, it says it could be $500 a day. And it should be a straight flat fee without negotiation. Plus, the township might have to go in and clean it up themselves if it gets to be too big of a problem. Sometimes it's not the falling snow, but it's the Kent County pushing that snow up on the sidewalks. Just remember, a lot of the properties along Plainfield are leased, and the landowners do not live in this township. They might be out of state, which complicates that cleanup. I hope you've developed an address booklet of all the property owners along the route. Moreover, what are you going to do eventually about 4 Mile, 5 Mile, and Huntsburger? Key walking areas for school kids or for people just trying to get up to Plainfield. Some of you know, I have harped on this before, but for some strange reason, the township doesn't want to take on this risk themselves, using a much simpler method. You know, you got so much extra money that the federal government is just throwing out. You could probably do this by yourself for years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Anyone else? Okay, seeing no one, I will close the floor for public comments at this time, and we'll move on to the review of our consent agenda. And before we start that, I would like to make a little revision here that we're going to move item 5B and make that 7C under new business. With that being said, if there's no other revisions or requests, I would at this time seek a motion to approve our agenda, including the consent agenda and accounts payable.
I move to approve the agenda, including the consent agenda and the accounts payable with the modification intact.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you, Jack. Second from Bill. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hagedorn?
Yes.
Ms. Beatty?
Yes.
Mr. Brinkman?
Yes.
Ms. Postma, yes. Mr. Coleman?
Yes. Okay, item 7 on our agenda for new business is to consider an ordinance to adopt and enact new zoning ordinance map and related matters. Cameron, you want to start us?
Okay, I'll start very briefly, turn it over to our staff, and then we have our planning consultants with us here as well tonight. So this started a couple of years ago, at least this effort started in earnest a couple of years ago, to look at Plainfield Avenue and determine how we can improve it. It's been something that our residents have been asking for years, and so we put together a concerted effort, pulled together a Citizens Advisory Committee. Some of you served on that committee, and took a deep dive into how do we fix up the avenue. And from that effort, we have a plan that this board adopted earlier this year. And now this is a huge piece of the implementation is the zoning that follows the plan so that we can put some of these elements into place. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our staff to go into some of the details, and then we have a presentation from Suzanne.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Is this working? Yep, okay. Cameron did a good job of giving the macro view of this whole thing. But as you know, we've been working on this for a long time, especially at staff level. We have multiple workshops with the Planning Commission, and then we had the joint workshop back in August, I believe. And since that meeting, we've made more progress on the changes to the zoning ordinance, proposed regulations anyways. So we've come a long ways with this whole document, changes to the map, et cetera. The Planning Commission considered it last month and held a public hearing. Some of the folks that were attending that public hearing are here this evening as well. Overall, the Planning Commission, as I noted in the staff report, you see in the meeting minutes, it was a 3-3 vote. We had one member, Chair Kessler, was absent at that meeting. So I would characterize the no votes as one of the commissioners had issue with the overall philosophy of changing the zoning regulations for the existing businesses. My characterization, the other two, I think, had concerns with certain portions of the regulations. Not a ton, but a few, and they just couldn't get past that, looking at the whole thing. But those were their issues. But the others that voted in favor of it were very supportive of the vision, all the work that the committee did. I think all the commissioners were appreciative. But the folks that voted yes were ready to move on and with this new vision. But I would say the planning commission as a whole recognized that if this gets approved by the board, we may be coming back for changes. This is a kind of a working document, if you will. It's not going to satisfy everybody. It's not the perfect ordinance. It's hard to do that, but it gets us going in the right direction for the vision that we had in the reimagined plan. So there are some major changes. So I would say overall the planning commission appreciated those efforts. But all the details, it's a struggle to get everyone, all these different folks on this, to an agreement on every single thing. So keep that in mind as we go through this. I'd like to introduce Suzanne and Julie from Progressive A&E. You've probably have seen them many times doing presentations back when we did the reimagined plan. So turn it over to Suzanne to walk us through this presentation, and then we'll have questions and answers after that.
Thank you, Bill. I first would like to acknowledge your staff. They are great. Everybody's really, really good to work with and have really enjoyed the journey. First, I'm going to cover a little bit, just to give you a little bit of a review of the Reimagined Plainfield Plan and the goals that we were trying to strive for with the zoning revisions, and then what those zoning revisions are, and then actually how we tested the proposed amendments on a site, just to show what it could be. For the plan process, you've seen part of this, but just a reminder, Whitmark closed in '97. Now it's torn down. Congratulations. The North Kent Mall opened 50 years ago this year and closed 20 years ago. And so we've seen changes on the site, from everything from the Meyer Outlet turning into a church, Kmart becoming a self-storage facility. You've got Lowe's, and we also have national trends where you're seeing more than 25,000 stores are anticipated to shut down permanently in standard malls. So retail has been changing dramatically, as have households. So a little over 58% of your households in 2010, we haven't pulled the 2020 census, were 1- and 2-person households. So you have a township that was made mostly of single-family homes, expecting the nuclear family, and yet you have half the households, more than half, that are 1- and 2-person households. And housing demand in Kent County estimates that it will need 22,000 more households in the next 5 years, or housing units to serve households that are both increasing in number but also changing demographically. So you might have fit 5 people in one household or housing unit, and now you have 1 or 2 persons living in that housing unit. So that has changed dramatically, and this is really touchy. Some of the trends I just covered, but part of the process, what we did is looked at what's been happening in the region and what's been happening along the corridor. And two graphics of note I want to point out on this chart. The upper right-hand corner shows what the Corridor Improvement Authority tax increment revenues were when the CIA was in existence for Plainfield Avenue. You'll see some zeros in there, which means there's no new increment created, no new development. And what you've seen is a lot of existing businesses that have maybe painted or spruced up a little bit, but you haven't seen a lot of demolition and redevelopment happening, which is where you would get that additional tax revenue coming from. And when we look at different forms of development and what other communities are doing, such as Hudsonville, the picture in the lower middle portion, the trend has been towards creating these village centers and creating more mixed-use development, which really leverages the value of the land and the potential for new housing units and jobs. And in this example, when we looked at the Hudson Center in Hudsonville to a standard strip center along Plainfield Avenue, what we found is that on half the land, they had double the value of a parcel. And that's from, as well as new residents and more jobs. So when we talk about how do we increase the health of both the township and the corridor in particular, we want to think about how do we facilitate economic development that really builds that vibrancy. And in the case of Hudsonville, really thinking about how do you create mini downtowns or recreate areas that are more walkable and pedestrian-oriented? What's that higher rate of return and increased property values, higher rents, retail sales? What's the price resiliency that you see to really provide that longevity and increased investment? And really, even the public health. You just had a gentleman talk about walking. And so creating these walkable communities has been something that's been identified by a number of people throughout the process. We also wanted to understand the retail environment in addition to just changing in the malls. How does Plainfield perform compared to Alpine and 4 Mile or Knapp in the East Beltline, and why are they getting some of the retailers that you're not? And what we found is that both of those locations have higher density. And Alpine in particular has a very large daytime population, double of what Plainfield does. So that helps provide the restaurants, with that daytime lunch crowd as well as the evening crowd. It really starts to create more business activity. And so a lot of the discussion focused on how do we think about mixed use in that discussion. And a lot of that came from a series of engagements that we had. The Plainfield Advisory Committee, the Redevelopment Corridor Advisory Committee, had a series of listening sessions, 7 listening sessions, where we asked experts to come in and share their insights. We also, during one of those, it was actually a walkthrough along the corridor with disability advocates of Kent County. We talked to real estate interests, developers. There was population discussion that we had, talking about changing demographics. There was a series of community surveys that we switched to because of COVID. So we were right in the middle of the process and COVID hit. So we pivoted to doing community surveys and asking people for their input electronically and through the newsletter. There was a charrette that was held with Planning Commission and Steering Committee at Progressive AE. And then we made sure through the Plainfield profile and the e-newsletter, there were weekly updates provided to the community. Also, virtually, we provided virtual webinars, and all the property owners along the corridor received letters notifying them of what was going on in engagement in the process. And we have a developer roundtable where we asked developers for their feedback as we thought about what those changes should be, and engaged specifically with some of the largest landowners. For example, Lormac Stern with the mall site, Meyer. I talked about MDOT and the Kent County Road Commission, particularly about the design of Plainfield Avenue. And then there were press releases and other things to get media attention and increase awareness. So these are the numbers that were provided regarding television exposure, print online media exposure, social media, to try to increase awareness about what was going on and engage people in the discussion. Through that, we created a vision statement that talks about the Plainfield Corridor is continually transforming into vibrant and prosperous places that are intentionally designed to serve the needs of our community. And a couple of those key words, continually transforming. So one of the challenges, and I think one of the difficulties we had even with the Planning Commission, is this idea of regenerative, kind of redevelopment. It's easy to think like once we've approved a project, we're done. That's the project and it's built and okay, that work's done, we're on to the next site. But really the idea of continually transforming, we need to keep up with the times. We need to generate that tax revenue to provide the services that the community expects. And we want to continue to have investment. And part of that with all the research has been creating those vibrant and prosperous places. So how are we creating economic centers where we have commerce happening and the people are investing? And then thinking about the needs of the community, the challenge has been with Plainfield Avenue. This, you'll see even the second one, traveling to as well as through. Right now, it's heavily auto-dependent. So you have a lot of drive-through restaurants and car dealers and other things that people don't recognize Plainfield as a place. And so how do we think about not just all of Plainfield, but segments of Plainfield as separate, different places that serve the neighborhoods behind it? And so there's 3 major themes in the plan: building vibrant places, traveling to as well as through, and greening the corridor. In building vibrant places, we talk about town centers being key nodes, looking at mixed use environments, and flexible and adaptable buildings. For the transportation component, of providing for a range of transportation modes, focusing on walkability and access management. And then for greening, creating compelling public spaces, increasing the tree canopy, and managing stormwater. And just the vision generally was to these 3 town centers, Meyer, around the Meyer, using Meyer as the grocery store as an anchor, the Plainfield Village Center, where the North Kent Mall used to be, and then Versluis Town Center in the north, really taking advantage of those lakes and the trails that are supposed to come through. 4 different trail connections are supposed to be occurring up in the northern portion. So how do we think about that, and then what connects them in between with a mix of uses, providing preservation for the existing residential, and really rethinking Plainfield Avenue itself so that it really starts to transform that. I won't go through all of the key recommendations. You're familiar with the plan from the presentation, but just trying to rethink kind of how do we do all these components. And so out of that, there came a number of key recommendations to lean towards the zoning ordinance. So this matrix talks about key design concepts, some of which I've blown up for you to see, but how well each one accomplishes the theme desired outcomes. And looking at how do we do that. So it's not just zoning in the master plan, but it's a whole mix of fixes, thinking about the Corridor Improvement Authority again, working with MDOT and the Road Commission to change the street, seeking public-private partnerships for redevelopment, public-public partnerships, and looking at economic development and incentives together to really get the changes that we'd like to have happen. And the zoning ordinance is a key component of that implementation strategy. So the policy, the corridor plan that you adopted is a policy document. That policy is not law. It sets that vision for the future, talks about investment, what we'd like to see. You need to have the plan in place to be able to have the zoning that follows it. And so we adopted the plan, and now we're on to the zoning section. And the zoning is law. It's a regulatory document. It provides for a building placement, height, orientation, access, talks about different uses and what zone districts, and really describes the purpose and intent. It's trying to carry that vision from the plan forward. And so the zoning amendments that, the highlights of the zoning amendments that are in the ordinance before you is to provide a range of uses, a variety of housing types and price points, facilitating multi-story buildings that frame the public realm, that frame the street. Traffic speed was a big issue, and we talk about street trees and buildings. How do we start to frame the street so we're naturally slowing down the traffic? Not trying to stop it. We understand it's a major throughway, but we also can change how people interact with it. Creating new public spaces, allowing parking to the side or the rear of the building, looking at shared parking between uses, trying to reduce curb cuts and employee access management. Encouraging the flexible building design. You have a number of buildings that were created for a single use. Trying to make sure that the floor to ceiling heights, for example, make it a reusable building for other future uses as you go forward. Looking at the orientation of entrances and the lot widths, looking at the encouraging variety and avoiding blank walls, and then focusing on landscaping and trees that both buffer the residential development behind it, but then also contribute to creating a walkable environment with things like shade. As Cameron mentioned, we had the Plainfield, we had 2 years working on the plan during COVID, and then we had the adoption of the plan, and then we spent 7 months working on the zoning amendments with 6 workshops with the Planning Commission, and then we also had the joint workshop with the Planning Commission and Township Board. We've also met with corridor businesses that have expressed an interest as we've gone through this process, and some of those you heard from during the joint meeting. So that we took the future land use map, and then this is a general map, and we have to understand the uses within it. And so in comparing that to your current zone districts that you have a number of commercial zone districts along this corridor. You have C1, C2, C3, C4, office, PUD, and we wanted to simplify the ordinance both for the ease of administration but also for the development community so that it's easy to understand and administer. So we have 2 zone districts. We're keeping PUD, but we have the mixed-use commercial zone district, which is shown in green, and then commuter commercial, which is shown in orange. There was a town center zone district that was proposed in those 3 areas that I mentioned, but based on the feedback that we had gotten from the Planning Commission, we took the town center zoning out. It's still in the master plan, so it's not lost, and if we had a developer with a large-scale plan that wanted to do more, they could certainly come in and have a discussion under PUD for town center. But we focused more on mixed use, and so that was a change that we made in response to what we heard. The preliminary map that we had for the zone districts included the southern portion being commuter commercial, that orangey yellow color. It did not include at the time the Speedway gas station and the car sales next to it. And I do want to mention that because we had received feedback from the property owner of the car sales, but they also own property across the street at the mall site. So the Venom Motorsports is owned by the same people. That area is not proposed to change. What happened is that Speedway was, we had, as consultants and staff had discussed before, as we were going through changing the maps and working through them, that Speedway, especially since it was reconstructed, it would be more appropriate to have it in the commuter commercial. Ideally, you don't want to have a single standalone piece there, so we looked to expand it. We had already had those discussions prior to meeting with the property owner, and so when the property owner also suggested it, that seemed to make sense to us. Again, but the properties under their ownership on the other side of the street are not included in those changes. The purpose and intent of the zone districts then is described in the zoning text. When we talk about mixed-use commercial and the intent, a lot of the language is very similar to what you see in the corridor plan itself. Key to that is talking about a broad range of uses, including retail, office, light industrial, and a variety of housing types. Currently, in your zoning ordinance, housing types are not allowed at all. Housing is not allowed on the corridor. And we wanted to be able to increase the number of uses. I do know that there's been some discussion and concern about nonconformities, and when we think about nonconformities, we need to think of them in kind of two different ways. There's nonconforming uses, and then there's dimensional nonconformities. So when we talk about that use table and what's allowed and the increase in the number of uses that we're allowing, we're not creating any nonconformities with the uses from the standpoint that we're increasing residential, we're increasing the opportunities for property owners to be able to use their properties in a variety of different ways that they currently can't do today. There may be, for example, an auto repair shop that would be non-conforming, but as long as they continue their operations, just as you would in any situation where a zoning is changed, they're allowed to continue to exist. And the non-conforming section recognizes that and provides flexibility for expansion and for change. So when we get questions, for example, if there is a bank refinancing and someone asks about what is the use of the property, is it a legal use? That's the question that the planning department usually gets, is related to the use. It's not related to the setbacks. So I wanted to kind of emphasize the use piece. The other potential modifications to the zoning that the plan spelled out, and so this is from the corridor plan, talks about parking shared between uses, location of parking, building frontage widths, building massing. And so we coordinated those recommendations with thinking about how do we provide more of a presence on the street for building height. How do we think about those floor-to-ceiling heights for reuse of the buildings? And then step back so that you don't read an entire building. If you have a three-story building, for example, it doesn't feel like the entire building is up. But we have required step backs, which is different than a setback. So this example from Bridge Street Market shows that you can tier buildings through regulations so that it softens its impression on the street. This does not characterize what's being proposed as far as this frontage here. It's much more like this, where the cadence of the development that we would like to see is you have the curb, you have a space which would have grass and trees, the sidewalk, and more grass and trees before you have the building front. So about 25 feet of space before you get to the building front. So we're not suggesting that you put the building right at the sidewalk, that we're giving it a little bit more of a softer touch, such as in this example that you see here. Other key concepts, new standards for landscaping screening. We reduced some parking requirements, just a few. Performance standards for uses, particularly 24-hour uses, and other uses such as assembly uses were addressed in this code, because if we're going to add residential into that area, we want to make sure that we have compatibility between the uses. And so those are special land uses that the Planning Commission would hear and determine whether or not it was appropriate for a more intense use to be located in the zone district. And then we also streamlined the development review, allowing for administrative approval of projects and some leniency for administrative departures where appropriate, subject to certain conditions that the planning department has to follow for standards. Other key concepts, and based on the input that we heard, there was discussion with the Planning Commission, and Mr. Art Spalding actually suggested special land use for increasing building height up to 100 feet for special land use. We made changes based on the Planning Commission's input regarding front setbacks, especially when there's access drives, and thinking about how to connect those frontages that have already been approved. If there's already cross-access agreements that cannot be altered or changed, we acknowledge that in the zoning codes so that property owners can still work within that and move their building up somewhat, but they still have to honor those if they can't have them changed. We can't get in between two private property owners and what they've agreed. So working through that, we've made special provisions in the ordinance, as well as more flexible provisions for nonconforming uses and buildings that exceeded what the township currently had. So in response to that, because we heard a lot from the Planning Commission and concern about nonconformities, what it does is it allows for gradual compliance. And I think in the joint meeting you heard Attorney Jeff Sluckett talk about this was a pretty flexible, very, very flexible nonconforming provision section, allowing for expansion even of nonconforming setbacks, allowing for kind of that gradual compliance that we're hoping to achieve. So they don't have to jump in and all of a sudden have to meet all the requirements of the ordinance. We're going for closer to compliance, gradual compliance over time, understanding these things grow and change. And so making sure that the provisions are really flexible, that staff has discretion to work with the property owner to find the best way to redevelop. And it gives it much more flexibility than you currently have today in your ordinance. And I wanted to just give some examples of that. So in your C1 and C2 zone districts, so the red is C1. And so currently in your zoning ordinance, let me go back. Currently in your zoning ordinance, these are your existing provisions you have in your current code today. So there's a 50-foot setback where it's abutting residential uses with a minimum 25-foot setback required in today's ordinance. If we look at those zone districts where we have C1 and C2, I apologize, this is super touchy. You can see the dimensions that were spelled out. I went into the Kent County parcel viewer, and they have a measuring tool, and you can actually measure what the setback is. So currently on the west side of Plainfield, you have distances of 10 feet, 13 feet from here to the residential zone district, not 50. You also, across the street, have the same situation where I couldn't tell because of the trees how close this is, so I said maybe it's 2 feet. But you've got, in this case, a drive-through that's 25 feet from the house. And you've got, again, 24 feet. So you have these situations in the C1 and C2 zone districts. You also, in the C4 zone district, have a minimum rear yard setback of 100 feet. And in this case, the C4 parcel here, located further down the hill, it's clearly not 100 feet. You've got 10-foot adjacent to this residential. So you've got a lot of existing conditions that may be there by variance or some other means, but they're by no means perfect that what you have in your current code today. So Julie's going to take you really quick through an example of the input and how we looked at a site just as a test based on the comments that you received at the joint meeting with the Planning Commission.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to see if I can make this bigger. Okay. How do I advance? Let's figure it out. Okay, so we, at the joint session that you guys had in July, were either approached by or, we paired with an existing property owner in the corridor to really take an existing site and an existing building and run through a couple of scenarios for redevelopment based on these new ordinance requirements. Because we want to bridge the gap between just, the theoretical of these zoning changes and, the tangible on the ground. What would this look like for an actual business in the corridor? So this here is 4494 Plainfield. It is home of Flo's Pizzeria and a few other commercial tenants. It is a single-story shopping center. It has 95 square feet of existing retail space, 45 parking spaces. And we wanted to take a look at two scenarios. One would be if we were to completely, rebuild from the ground up, what might be possible under the new zoning ordinance. So this is a rendition that we did showing a new building of the same square footage, but located closer to the right-of-way. So as Suzanne mentioned before, one of the goals of the zoning amendments is to allow for framing the street with buildings to create more of a pedestrian scale as folks are walking by, making it a more, pleasing environment to walk through, but also by bringing those buildings up, we're actually sort of intuitively influencing the behaviors of drivers, getting them to slow down. And so this shows, just by moving the site up, we're able to go into closer conformance with the zoning ordinance, have similar number of parking spaces in the back by having a shared access agreement with the property owner to the north. We didn't work with the property owner to the north to see, is this specific shared access agreement something that would be possible? But this is just sort of a sample of what could be possible should, a redevelopment occur. And then as you can see with the new zoning regulations, it's possible to have residential or office space above the ground floor commercial. So here is an elevation showing, what that might look like. And then we wanted to do an example of, an addition. So what would be possible if we wanted to expand our space and get into closer compliance with the zoning ordinance, but we're not going to do a complete rebuild, right? And so this is a concept that we came up with, having sort of an L shape by adding an addition that does get closer to the right-of-way and adds that framing that I talked about before. In this new concept, slightly less parking, although with the parking requirements, this actually would meet parking standards. In the existing conditions, the site is actually exceeding the required parking. So that's something to keep in mind. And as was applicable with the previous example, having residential or office above is something that would be possible with these new amendments. So this here is a elevation showing what that might look like from the street. So I want to say that, is this the end of our presentation, or Suzanne's taking it back over?
Yeah. So we wanted to see if you had any questions for us.
Let me find the right green button here. Before we do that, I'd like to open up for public comments, and then we will address the board's questions, comments, concerns. So at this time, I would open the floor for any public comments on this item on our agenda. Same rules as I applied before. So If anyone would like to go, please raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. I guess you're on your way. State your name and address for the record, and off we go.
Tom Nineheis, 3669 Plainfield Avenue, the old Plainfield Lumber Building. I've listened, I've been to a couple of these meetings, I've never spoken before, but a couple of things that I always hear is that it was overwhelming support from the residents. You know, well, why wouldn't it be? I mean, there's of no cost, there's no negative to the residents, their taxes aren't gonna go up. And I've heard how my property, which is non-conforming, or will be, is I'm gonna have more options. It's gonna be better for me. Well, I have more options, but they're at a lower zoning. Residential, all those things are value-driven. The lower the zoning, the less the property's worth. And if I look at my property, I have a 34,000 square foot building. It's a warehouse. It's on Plainfield Avenue. There's nothing like it on Plainfield Avenue. And for me to sit and look at this mixed use, which they want to change it to, no one's going to put that kind of money into that building to make it comply with what goes in this plan. My building needs to be zoned commuter commercial now. Even though, and it could easily be split off. It's on the very end of that. There's a road right next to it. It's a warehouse. It's 34,000 square feet. I mean, and if it gets tore down, I'm only getting land value for it, which is not gonna be worth the building, you know, what the building is worth. So, I mean, I've done I just don't feel that you can pigeonhole. I think that you can't just, bunch all these zoning together on Plainfield Avenue. And I think it's really gonna hurt the value of my land. It's very, very upsetting to me. I gotta be honest with you. I'm just a small business owner. This is supposed to be my retirement. I bought this building as an investment. I don't have a 401k. I don't have a big retirement plan. I bought this building, I work hard, I paid for it. We had a little snag when I bought it and was told we were grandfathered and we had to put sprinkling in. We spent almost $100,000 bringing it up to code. And am I gonna get that $100,000 back? Now, if they tear the building down, right now, I've had 3 letters of intent to purchase the property. I currently have it for sale. The first 2, we didn't even acknowledge because they wouldn't have passed under the old zoning. The third one is similar use to what I have. It would be allowed across the street in the new zoning. It'd be allowed under commuter commercial zoning. It's a similar use, but it's they've come to the planning commission, talked to the planner, didn't get a real warm response, and the comment from my realtors is that they're not gonna spend time, money, and resources into a fight that they don't feel they can win. Well, that's really, when I sit here and look at all these plans and how we're gonna adjust things and what we're gonna do, I'm just the little guy that's taking it on the chin. I put $100,000 into the building, am I gonna get that back? It's just very, very, and I can't afford to spend any more money on my building. A non-conforming building, I can't afford to do it. I've invested money into it, and and I don't think, so I'm sure over time it's gonna continue to deteriorate. But I don't really think that we're going to get, I don't know what will go in my building if it's not allowed to be used as a warehouse type situation as to what I use it now. So it's just very, very, very disappointing to me. And I know Susan talked about this is going to be a work in progress. It's going to be over time. We're going to try to get these things more conforming. Well, my time is now. My building's for sale. Am I going to sit on it if I want to turn it into another Whitmark? And I still think that no development could be worse than maybe not having the ideal development for what you want. And like I said, my building could easily be split off. It's right on the end. It's a unique parcel. There's nothing like it on the avenue. And I just feel that this is really, really putting the handcuffs on me. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I guess Mr. Fields.
Hi, I'm Mr. Fields, 4440 Plainfield. Also, property owner, I spoke to Larry Walt just before the meeting, and he wanted me to actually speak for him for a second too, so hopefully I can get an extra minute out of that. He actually said that he liked the plan, and he'd like to ask you guys, or his opinion to be is that if he could just take out the non-conforming use clause. But being able to have the latitude to do some of these things you're talking about, but if you don't, you're not held in punishment. And something that Tom said, if you're non-conforming use, I feel like with my building, it's actually gonna hurt the value, and it's also part of my retirement. But if it's non-conforming use, why would I put money into something that's, if I go to sell it, if I could sell it, that, I think you're gonna find maybe some reverse complications going on here where people aren't gonna spend the money if they're not conformed. If they can't get rid of it, they're just gonna use it and let it go to pot. So maybe giving some people some options to be able to do more things, but not, and I agree with Larry, I think that's great if we had the ability to do more things, but not being considered a non-conforming use for a resale value for somebody that would want to spend the money and put it into it. L-shaped picture they showed, I think that problem with that is that you've got two neighbors that would have an easement that gets shut down. So like in the strip you talked about, I think that's a problem. So that's something else you have to recognize with an L shape or a building like that one that actually is a pretty nice building on Plainfield, one of the nicer looking ones. He's not gonna tear that $1 million building down to spend another million or two to get closer to the road. It's just not gonna happen. And again, I'm sure it's part of his retirement plan. So it's a long process, and it's nice to give more options, but I guess I'd like you guys to think about not penalizing the people that, well, isn't most everybody gonna be non-conforming use immediately? You know, maybe you guys can answer that when you're talking construction costs right now. It's a tough time to ask people to do this, and of course, it's a long-term thing, it's not quick and immediate, but it's grandiose, it's really cool. I don't know that I want a building right on top of me going down Plainfield. What I'd really like to see is what we have existing. Let's start with what we've got and see it start to look nicer. Please look at the Walgreens at Plainfield and 4 Mile. It's bad. And this is what we're dealing with now, is that this is the immediate situation. How do we talk to Walgreens and say, please make your place look nicer, and your sign sits on that corner? One more minute for Larry? I must have been boring you. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
David Uccello, 4494 Plainfield, the beautiful building that was presented. I don't have a speech prepared or anything. One, I wanted to come over here and thank all of you for all the work you do. I know this is not an easy situation. I know, reimagining a corridor, you're not going to make everyone happy, and I full-heartedly understand that. Let me step back. I do see the vision for the corridor. Obviously, I was part of the committee. I signed off on that plan. One of the major oppositions that I have is also the non-conforming. I brought that up during the committee. I was told that it would be hashed out at later boards and whatnot. That's still the case today. And I don't think that, maybe a complete removal of non-conforming, maybe having more roadways to get to conforming. Like, for example, that presentation that we had, the second one, which I really liked, and would be something I actually would spend, and move forward with, is still non-conforming. That second, outlook on where I bring 50% of my building up to the street, it's still non-conforming. So now you're asking me to spend, millions of dollars and to, still a non-conforming building. Aside from that, I have had obviously discussions, with our neighbors, Medwar. There's absolutely no chance they're giving me that, cut out. So that's basically, ends there. So again, I'm not here really to say that I'm completely opposed to it. I do like the vision, but I think there might be a better way than just completely, getting rid of the old ordinance, slapping a new one, all these buildings become non-conforming. Maybe an incentivized approach where we have a well-funded Plainfield Corridor Improvement Authority that we can take advantage of some tax incentives, et cetera, and more push the building owners and landowners to do it out of incentive as opposed to, being non-conforming. So I'm not, again, I just want to make clear, I'm not completely opposed to it. I like the vision. Just want more ways to become conforming. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, seeing no one, I'll close the public comment section. And Suzanne, would you like to address some of that before we start?
I can.
Thank you.
In regards to Mr. Ninehouse's comments about his building, I totally agree with him that it is a unique parcel and it has a ton of potential. And the proposed ordinance will give him more marketability because he can use it for more things than he currently can use it for today. And so that does make it more attractive. The housing shortage, and even though there's construction costs that have been rising, rents have been rising as well. And there are still developers that are coming into the market looking for additional sites. And some of them have identified Plainfield as a location because of the proximity to the highway and to downtown. So I think part of the discussion, and it kind of addresses some of the other comments that you've got, is really what is a nonconformity, and what about those? So what a nonconformity is that it means, the definition of a nonconformity is it was legal at the time it was built, okay, or the use was established. So under whatever the zoning is, it was created under that zoning and it was allowed. You get a non-conforming situation, whether it's a building or a use, when you change the rules and you don't allow what had been there before to be there in the future. So, for example, in the case of Mr. Uccello's property, all of his uses today are conforming, and tomorrow they'll be conforming as well, because he has a whole range of uses that are already in the building. There's nothing about that site that makes the uses in that building non-conforming. Zoning does not assume that you're going to tear everything down. It doesn't require a property owner to do anything with their property. If things stay the same, that's fine. You don't have to go, oh, we've changed the zoning, now you have to demolish your building. That's not how it works. You have a bundle of property rights for the use, for the building. They stay with the property. The reason you have non-conforming zoning provisions in your zoning ordinance are to preserve those property rights of those landowners. So that's why those provisions are there. It's not to say, it's the reverse of saying, oh, now you're all illegal and you have to do away with what you have. That's not the purpose of non-conforming provisions. But non-conforming provisions are there to say, we acknowledge your building and your use, and we have to figure out, the way we've written it in the code is we're going to work with you to figure out how you can do more with your site and to change it over time to try to meet the vision we have. But we're not expecting wholesale redevelopment of your site if that's not what you want to do, or changing all the uses in your building if that's not what you want to do. And the way that those provisions were written have to do with several different groupings. So with the use, with the building, and with the site. So you might have someone who says, I want to change the parking lot around and I want to do that. Well, we'd like to see a couple trees in there. So you might have to add some trees, but maybe it's not, you have to re-landscape the entire parking lot. What it says is if you're redoing this small portion, we're looking at that discrete portion, not everything. Some communities will take a much more aggressive approach and say everything has to come into conformance for your landscaping now because you've touched the site. That's not at all how this was written or it was intended. These provisions are very similar to the ones that have been in existence in the city of Grand Rapids now for 13 years, 14 years. And we even augmented those and changed them to be even more flexible in this code for you to be able to provide that flexibility and acknowledge it. You currently already have non-conforming situations on the corridor, like I already showed you with your setbacks. So this really, I'm really not concerned, and I don't mean to dismiss the concerns that were expressed, but having lived it and worked with buildings that are 100 years old and zoning has changed multiple times over a site, it's about gradual change. It's not wholesale change and changing the property rights of somebody. It's trying to work with them to deliver something that they hopefully can get more density for, they can create more value in their property, and they can get new investment in it. The challenge you have today is that your taxes have been relatively flat along the corridor. You're not getting that new investment. And so while some may say this is a drastic change, what other change would you do? I mean, it is a change, but I would say it's really not that drastic. It's just allowing more things to happen, allowing more development area to happen. Currently, your front setbacks are required 75 feet from the property line. This allows another 50 feet of front, across the entire parcel to be used for a different use than they currently have today. So we've just increased the usable area of the land for someone. How they provide parking, they can work with the township to figure that out. So it's really about trying to be more flexible and changing the amount of area that can be developed and what can be developed within it. So that's really the key to it, and incentivizing the approach, incentivizing those development changes that you want to see can come through the Corridor Improvement Authority, but you need to have the revenue that's generated from the increased tax increment to be able to help those property owners pay for facade grants and to help them pay for beautification on their properties. If you don't have those increased tax revenues coming in, you can't assist because there's just nothing to pay for or to use for. So I think that's kind of the response. I really think that, and you've got a really great staff and they can use judgment. If there's something that's not working, and as Bill mentioned, this is a work in progress. The zoning it's not the Bible, it's not fixed. It's you are in control as the legislative body of the zoning code. And as you live with it and you find what works and what doesn't work, it can be fine-tuned. So that's the thing is it should be constantly evolving, and you're going, trends change. I mean, whoever thought you'd have a double drive-through or an electronic billboard or an Amazon provisioning center. All these things, these uses change over time, and part of a community's evolution is responding to those changes in technology and in zoning, in development preferences, and different ways to be able to serve the community. So I think relying and working with staff and even expecting, you could ask for a report card or to say what changes you've been hearing and what do we need to modify over time if something's not working. But I feel very confident that we're increasing the amount of developable area that landowners can use on their property in the future. We're increasing the number of uses, but it also comes with some expectations about how much what the windows are going to be and some other things. But that's the trade-off, right? Is that you're allowing more, but you also have some expectations for quality development to go with it.
Staff, anything to add at this point, or are we ready for board discussion?
Ready for board discussion.
Okay. That's over, sir. Okay, Kathy, you want to start us?
I appreciate your thoroughness, Suzanne, in your presentation. I know I have heard, and I would love to hear more about the developers' reactions. And I know you've had discussion with potential developers. And is it possible to, I don't know if we're going to allow her to come up, or are we just discussing, that you would speak to that, of what you see as the potential developers who...
Yeah, and I would also suggest directing it to staff as well, because they've had people come in who are landowners along the corridor who've come to talk to staff as well. So I've had, for example, there was a developer out of Indianapolis that does amazing mixed-use projects, 50 to $100 million projects. They look for water, they look for trails. And so we met with Cameron, and we met up by Versluis Lake and talked about that area and what that potential was. And they said, if you can get the road changed, and there's some ideas on how you could, to modify the road and still get that number of cars through, but maybe do a different design. They said, if you could do that, we'd be here in a heartbeat. We'd be interested. So it's understanding the transportation component with the land use component, but I know staff has had other discussions with property owners, and I would encourage them, hear from your staff, because they're dealing with it on a daily basis.
Yeah, and maybe Peter or Elizabeth, if they want to jump in, they can. We've fielded half a dozen calls from property owners that have heard about, what's this Reimagine Plainfield thing all about, and hear about it. And I will say some of the sites are on the main part of our corridor, and some of the sites are down further at the bottom of the hill. Don't want to tell you who specifically, because they, out of respect for them, but they're very interested, and a couple of them commented that the uses that they have on site right now, they don't see as sustainable, and they're pretty excited about doing something under this mixed-use scenario. So explain it to them, and they're looking forward, some of them, hey, let me know when this is adopted and you can talk the talk, because we can only say at this point it's being considered, nothing's approved. And so I think we have at least a half a dozen folks that I think we're going to be visiting with and talking to. Mr. Ninehuis, I think, as I suggested, the Planning Commission meeting, you probably need to come and talk with staff, and we can sit down and talk about some of the scenarios you've heard tonight. And I think we can help answer your questions that way. So you and I yep. Well, I've been back for 2 days. So, yeah. Yeah, and I told him I was going on vacation. I will get a hold of them as I promised. So that said, we have some potential conversations coming up, but no one's come in with like, hey, we got plans yet, because we haven't approved anything yet.
Much. Parking standards, can you address that, how we have revised that? Because, boy, that would be interesting to me.
And I'll look to Julie too, because there was really only two areas where we just lowered the parking count a little bit. One was for housing and one was for retail. Because I think you had was it 5 per 1,000? I think we took it down to maybe 3 1/3 per 1,000 square feet. But the big change with the parking was looking at a variety of different ways you could look at reducing parking requirements. So you have the standard, and that's that number. But then, for example, there's a mixed use component. So if you have just straight retail in your building, that's one number. But if you had retail and residential, and the hours usually overlap, so they're usually different. So your daytime use for your office or your retail use will be different than an evening use for your residential. So there is some overlap in there, but the way the provision is it acknowledges that you don't need to provide a parking space for every single square foot of your building, that you're going to have you're allowed some flexibility in how you look at it. And also for shared parking. So if a property owner could come into agreement with their neighbor on how they want to do parking and maybe rearrange it or do more of a district lot where they're sharing that parking, that they could benefit from that more of a shared parking arrangement rather than everybody having their own parking. Now, again, that's up to the property owners on how they do it, but it just gives them more options. So the designs with the parking section was to try to provide more flexibility and options for property owners if they wanted to do that, and to give some staff some more discretion on it. You've got some really big parking areas for some of your buildings. I always think of the Little Caesars and all the parking that's around the Little Caesars and how much parking that is. So it really says you can reduce, you can share, you can do a number of different things.
That in itself would help a lot for
Yeah, it would.
environmental. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Jack?
Well, Suzanne and Julie, I appreciate all the work you guys have put into this. I know it's been multiple times you've been dealing with this with a variety of people. I'm concerned about the words non-conforming being a bad word. It's like, you know, the issue of non-conforming never comes up until you try to make a change, and all of a sudden, non-conforming is a bad word. And you know, as you pointed out, Susan, you know, there are a number of properties that are non-conforming now as we speak, and that issue never came up, but all of a sudden now it's coming up because we have something new that we're trying to propose. I appreciate the new zoning ordinance. It's I see flexibility all over it, and I appreciate that a lot. And what you mentioned, the staff mentioned, it's a work in progress and long-term, and I understand that some of the problems that people are experiencing are immediate problems, but and unfortunately there are, in some cases you can't do much about that, but over the long term, if people can hold off and watch what happens over a number of years, there would be just a very nice, pleasant place in Plainfield, and that's what we're looking for, and I can see that, and so, yeah, sometimes you have to give up the short-term view to look at the long-term view, and that's kind of where I'm at with it. I know Planning Commission had some problems with it, and I can understand that most of it was around the whole idea of non-conforming, and I don't want to see that as a bad word. It's something that exists and we live with. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Jack. Kathleen?
Thanks, Tom. You guys have done an amazing amount of work, and, you know, the vision is amazing. However, for me, one of the concerns is that we will never be downtown Grand Rapids. We will not be Bridge Street. We will not be South Division, thankfully. I think as long as I worked in the city of Grand Rapids, looking at Division now, it's a disaster with 2 lanes and a bike lane and no parking. So, and you know, all the buildings on Bridge Street are already built right up at the sidewalk anyhow. I think we need to be flexible. I know I've had contact from several business owners about the non-conforming clause, and it is a concern to me. I think we need to be flexible through this whole thing. But as I even discussed with Tom earlier today, that we need to be prepared. Right now, we don't have the climate to build in because of the economy, but we do need to be prepared down the road that when it is, that we can move forward, that we're accessible to, we're amenable to some of these developers that want to come in. Absolutely. I think it's important for community development to address Mr. Nineheis's concerns and, you know, and Mr. Field's concerns, because they're not the only property owners I've heard that from, is, you know, what's going to happen to their property value. So that is a concern for me. I think that's all I have right now.
I don't know if
Oh,
we should be
I didn't know if you wanted to respond or just, you're okay?
No, it's your comment period. I just didn't know.
Okay.
I wanted to be available if there were questions, and then I
Yep.
wasn't sure if I should
Okay.
sit down. I'll sit down.
Bill?
Well, folks, my opinion, I believe we already started reimagining Plainfield. My wife tells me this every time we go by that new building there, that they used to be Kmart. And it really has dressed the area up considerably. We are reimagining Plainfield now, and we continue to do this throughout our times. A misstatement was made by Mr. Chester. He said that we had used the law of eminent domain to destroy the Whitmart building. And believe me, folks, I shopped in Whitmart 20 years ago, and I remember the whole situation there. But it was not law of eminent domain. We ordered demolition, and the man's paying for it. So it's not coming out of our taxes or anything like that. he got his just deserves. And we went to court, and they agreed with us. And that was the way it should have been. Progress is always difficult, and change is always difficult to implement and do this. But now it's going to clear a lot when we see old Blythe like White and Whitmark taken out. That's something that deserves to be taken out. But because they were not abiding by our ordinances, not that. When we had the vote on this, I couldn't see eminent domain. What are we going to use it for eminent domain? Let's tell the truth about it. It's a Blythe, and it has to be taken down. And we did that. And that's where I see that the reimagine is. This is the picture of the future, really. And you go and you look at how much of an improvement it is with Kmart right now. I mean, if you just drive down, because my wife comments every time she goes by when she sees that. And I think it's going to happen all along the line. There's sort of a spirit we'll start to get to make our community look better and to make it a place that we want to live in and go to, instead of going over to Alpine all the time, because they sort of stole a march on us there. But it's a place we want to live, and that's where we're going to live. Now, I've been here for 40 years, so don't disappoint me that you're not going to approve it, because I think it's going to be a good advance there. There was one thing that was already, this plan is outdated, and I would talk with Suzanne about it today. I went very carefully through all of the plan there, and I noticed that there is no statement about electric cars, and that's going to have to go into that. We're not ready for that because we haven't got that, but that's not in there yet, and that's coming in, and you know that's going to happen. I'm not so sure it's going to happen right away, but it's going to happen. So I believe that this is needed. This is a sign of progress. We're looking to the present and to the future, and this is what we should do. And we wanted to reimagine it. We want it to look like what we want to see when we drive by, not a wrecked building, things like that we've been seeing for the last 20 years, and things of this nature. We don't want squalor and brownfield around us. We want this done.
Okay, thank you, Bill. From my perspective, I've been involved in the Reimagine thing as much as possible throughout this time. And is this a perfect plan? I don't think there is such a thing. We can't possibly craft something that's going to make everyone warm and fuzzy up and down Plainfield Avenue. But does our community want to see Plainfield Avenue change? Absolutely. Do they have unrealistic expectations sometimes? Absolutely. But we have to start somewhere. This is a living, breathing kind of situation. We're going to have to be flexible. We're going to have to be nimble. We're going to have to do all those things that our community wants us to do to make Plainfield into something that it currently is not. So from my perspective, we need to get this ball rolling. The moratorium needs to end. We got to start somewhere. We run into problems, we run into obstacles, we'll address them. That's my 2 cents worth. You guys made some eloquent statements that I agree with wholeheartedly. I don't want to repeat those. Kathleen, valid points. Staff is always willing to work with anyone. So come in and talk to them. So that would be my 2 cents worth. Anything else from anyone else? Bill?
Just to remind you that you have an ordinance before you to adopt and enact a brand-new zoning ordinance and map. And as it relates to the moratorium, I don't know if you recall, but there's a section that talks about when it ends. The moratorium is set to expire on December 31st, or at such time a new ordinance and map become in effect. So in theory tonight, if you were to approve the zoning ordinance and map, we have to do a notice of, we have to publish a notice saying the board has adopted this. Once that gets in the paper, which would probably be later this week, early next week, it becomes effective 7 days after publication. So in theory, late next week, week of December 6th. But as soon as that becomes effective, the moratorium will end automatically. you don't need to take any additional action on it. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, thank you. And I guess as a last statement, thank you for all your work. Thank you to the Planning Commission. Thank you to staff. Thank you to all the people who participated in this. I think we did as much as we could to try to communicate with the community. So their input was heard, I hope. So with that being said, at this time, I'll seek a motion.
I move to enact the new zoning ordinance and map as presented.
Second.
Thank you, Kathy. Support from Jack. Roll call vote, please.
Okay, Mr. Hagedorn.
Yes.
Ms. Beatty?
Yes.
Mr. Brinkman?
Yes.
Ms. Postmus, yes. Mr. Coleman?
Yes. Okay, item 7B is to consider an ordinance to adopt and enact the new land division ordinance. Cameron?
Okay, we'll turn this over. We've got our planning staff here. I'm going to let them
Okay.
run with this one.
You hear me? All right, so last month, we were gonna consider this, we had a posting error on this. We did this in conjunction with the private road ordinance. They kind of go hand in hand, although this land division ordinance is not dependent on it. So when we were doing the land division ordinance, we thought it was an opportune time to update the technical aspects of this and make it more consistent with the zoning ordinance in terms of text and language. Really not a whole lot on this. I do want to let you know this is a repeal and replace ordinance to amend. Go through a couple of the brief changes on here. One is to add escrow. So if we have a legal issue or something to go through, we can use an escrow to draw from for legal funds and things like that. The other one is we can deny unbuildable or poorly designed lots to create like a lot that's on 10% grade, which is not technically feasible and stuff administratively. And then the other aspect of it is you can still, or we created it so you can now do open space lots, lots that are not developable if they're part of a plan for recreation or things like that, because there are some advantages to the community in doing so. All in all, this is basically just an update and consistency for the overall ordinance, and I look at it as a house cleaning item largely. But if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Pete. I would open the floor at this time for public comment on this item on our agenda, if anyone has any. Seeing no one, I'll close the floor for public comment, and we'll just move on to board discussion. Bill, do you have anything?
This is just in general, I'm getting ready for my Santa Claus time. We've got the taxes coming on the 1st of December. That's all.
No,
taken care of.
we're talking about the land division
Okay.
thing here. Anything on that?
Well, I'll get to the other one later.
Yeah, you can do Santa Claus in a little while.
Got a table for that, so something,
Okay.
I'm all set.
Kathleen, you're good? Jack?
I wanted to ask you a question. What's the current situation on keyhole lots?
Okay, so that is largely addressed in the zoning ordinance. So when we did the update earlier this year, I think it was March or April, we had cleaned up a lot of that language. We ran into the Sebers Cove development issue, so a lot of that's been cleaned up. This language that we fixed in here makes those two mesh together because they didn't. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Jack. Kathy? All set?
Good, thank you.
Okay. So I'll seek a motion at this time.
I move to approve the proposed ordinance to adopt and enact a new Plainfield Charter Township Land Division ordinance.
Thank you, Kathleen. Support from Bill. Roll call vote, please.
Hey, Mr. Brinkman.
Yes.
Mr. Hagedorn.
Yes.
Ms. Beatty?
Yes.
Ms. Postmus, yes. Mr. Coleman?
Yes. Okay, so item C is the one I moved, so I'll just take that and go. How do you like that? So item C was actually 5B, which is our board meeting dates. There was an email sent around about changing our time from 7 p.m. meetings to 6 p.m. meetings. I don't know that we had a consensus in email, but how does everybody feel about that? I'm fine with 6 o'clock. Kathy?
I think 7, I said in my email, I prefer 7 because I think it gives people the opportunity to finish their day, get their meal or whatever, and then come to the meeting. But if everyone else wants to go with 6, I can do that too.
Jack?
I agree with Kathy and add the fact that we are now electronic, so people can stay home and still see the board meeting. So I'm fine with 6.
You're good with 6. Kathleen?
I'm good with 6. I know a lot of other jurisdictions, municipalities start at 6. And since we are virtual, then, you know, people can watch it from home.
Okay, Bill?
Well, I just thought that you guys were setting this up so that you could help me lose weight, because, you know, that's when I eat my dinner at home. It's enough because I'll work and do a home at 5 o'clock, but I appreciate your efforts because we all need to do that. But I like to keep it at 7 or 6:30. I'll compromise on that.
I don't know if I want- Maybe this is why email didn't work any better.
I'm good with 6.
You're good with 6? How about a motion to make our meeting time?
I move that we change our meeting time for the upcoming year to 6 PM instead of 7 PM.
Thank you, Kathleen. Support?
Support.
Thank you, Kathy. Roll call vote, please.
Okay, Ms. Beatty?
Yes.
Mr. Hagedorn?
Yes.
Mr. Coleman?
Yes.
Ms. Postma, yes. Mr. Brinkman?
No.
Sorry for your dinner, Bill. Next item on the agenda is superintendent comments. Cameron?
Okay, thank you. First, thank you for your work on the zoning for Reimagine Plainfield. Thank you to our consultants, to our staff. That was a long process to do some heavy lifting on some things that were badly over-needed. And so I'm very optimistic about the future of Plainfield Avenue. I think there's a lot of potential there that will be untapped with lifting restrictions that we've had on it for years. The Whitmark building is gone. The Kmart building, I saw Kmart in the news this week. The very last Kmart in Michigan closed this weekend.
Yes, I saw that.
You imagine that. So things change. So the Kmart store, it's a Michigan store, is no longer in Michigan. Banks may not need branches in 15 years. Car dealerships may sell more online than in person. You know, as we look at what might be changing, we can't predict that. We don't know what's coming. So we need to have rules that are flexible enough to allow for whatever change comes to come, and that we're not stuck in dealing with zoning that thinks of how things are today or used to be, but allows for, as things change, the zoning is flexible as well. So I'm optimistic that our changes will allow for that, and as a number of you mentioned, it's a living document. We'll revise it with time as needed. So thank you for your work on that. I know many of you have probably noticed that there's a spike in COVID numbers again, both in the state of Michigan, locally in Kent County. Spectrum Health has put themselves on a red status, that their availability of rooms in hospitals is as low as it's been at any point in this pandemic. And as Bill pointed out to me earlier today, the state has put out an order encouraging masks. I don't think anyone dares mandate masks anymore. It's just too political. But I do want everyone to be cognizant of that. Be careful as you're traveling around, and we'll continue to monitor that. I don't know that it requires any change of operations at this time, but we'll continue to watch that and see how it affects operations here as well. Fire staffing, that's something that we've been looking at since our last meeting. Chief McKellar has promoted 3 individuals that are part-timers to full-time status. They will begin after the first of the year. And we have had some additional applications come in for part-timers. So we are getting some additional new faces at the department, which will help some of our staffing needs there as well. So I believe they're starting in training shifts next month already. So glad to hear that, especially as the fire calls continue to come in. So we need to make sure our staffing is there to answer the call. My last item, budget meeting, next meeting. This is the latest in the year since I've been here that we've adopted the budget. I'm starting to make Warren sweat a little bit, but he's pulling double duty right now as we're trying to fill Kendra's position, and so he's been handling a lot more tasks. And we've done a lot more with the budget this year than typical years, between additional federal dollars that have come in, changes with fire staffing. We've had a lot more changes to the budget since the initial budget was presented, and so those documents will be coming your way in the next couple of weeks here, and that will be on your agenda for the next meeting to adopt. It's a situation where we keep making it work, but it's not necessarily sustainable, where we're budgeting a draw from our fund balance, and it seems to get a little bit larger every year. Right now, we're looking at a draw from fund balance of roughly $900,000, which is not a sustainable way to operate, but all the one-time dollars have been able to float us along. At this point this year, even though we budgeted to take $400,000 from savings, it looks like we're actually going to put $200,000 into savings. So with that kind of math, it gives a little more confidence to go into next year with budgeting that far into the red, but it's not something we can continue to do into the future. So we do need to take a close look at that and see and make sure that our operations are sustainable and that we've got the finances to do what we want to do with public safety. So with that, have a happy Thanksgiving.
All right, thank you, Cameron. Next up, board comments. Bill, why don't you go back to your Santa thing? Go ahead, you go first.
Oh, you mean the Christmas
Here
present
here you go,
coming out.
you're on.
That's on its way, and everything is set, so you'll receive it, and we'll be having the winter taxes come out. And that's important for your income taxes too, so that's a good thing we got that out. It's kind of quiet around the office really at times, but especially at this time. And we appreciate all of your helps that you've given us and things of that nature, so.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Kathleen?
The only thing I have is I just appreciate the work that everybody's done. Community development, you guys have been amazing. This last year, I think we've got a lot accomplished, so thank you for that.
Thank you. Jack?
I'm going to give another plug for the Rockford's Got Talent. I mentioned it last time. I'm on the board for the Rockford Area Endowment, Community Endowment, and you may have seen the Rockford Squire of last week. Got Talent, Rockford needs you for an inaugural community talent show. And the question always is, how does this affect Plainfield Township? This is Rockford. Rockford Community Endowment is concerned with any area that's within the Rockford School District. So we've been giving grants to, for instance, we gave a grant to the band to participate in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade a few years back. And I suspect they'll be back for us because they're going to be participating in the New Year's Day Parade in Southern California. So this Rockford's Got Talent is something that the whole Rockford area is getting around. Right now, we have contributions of $35,000 toward the sponsorships, and what we're really needing is talent. So if you know anybody that can juggle or dance or sing or do anything, go to Facebook page, Rockford's Got Talent, and have them apply. First place prize is $500, second place is $300, third place is $100. And we have two divisions. We have the regular division, then we have school age division. So encourage you to do that. The deadline is the end of November, so get them in here.
All right, thank you, Jack. Kathy?
Just a happy Thanksgiving and congratulations to all of us in adopting this zoning. And I'm excited to make Plainfield not look like 1950s anymore. So happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you. All right, so I don't have any magnificent comments, so I will just right now move on to the next item on our agenda, which is a closed session. So I would seek a motion at this time to retire into closed session to discuss the purchase of real property.
I move to enter into closed session to consider the purchase of real property as permitted by MCL 15.268, Parents D, which is part of the Open Meetings Act.
Thank you, Kathleen. Second from Bill. Roll call vote, please.
Ms. Beatty?
Yes.
Mr. Hagedorn?
Yes.
Mr. Brinkman?
Yes.
Mr. Coleman?
Yes.
Ms. Postma, yes.